The first thing the man did, upon returning to the day before the apocalypse, was to slaughter each and every one of the cows on his family's farm, as those cows were the entire livelihood of the Zhu family. The villagers who saw him were stunned, muttering that he had gone completely insane, while his ex-girlfriend, who was nearby, mocked him, saying that even if he sold all those cows, it still wouldn't be enough to cover her 80,000. Furthermore, she claimed she already had a rich boyfriend who would take care of it, and that he should just give up. Before she could continue speaking, he coldly interrupted her and told her to get lost, that he didn't want to waste time because he had cows to kill. He knew that no one around him would understand what he was doing, because only he knew that in 3 hours, all hell was going to break loose. The end wouldn't begin with humans, but with animals. The cattle would mutate first, becoming wild, aggressive, and bloodthirsty, and would attack every living being. Then, the virus would spread to humans faster than anyone could imagine, and in less than 1 month, the entire world would collapse. In his past life, he had watched helplessly as his family died before his eyes, but this time he had sworn he would not allow it. Just then, his parents arrived amidst the chaos with obvious worry. His father, raising his voice, asked him what was happening, that if there was a problem, they could talk it out. But how were they supposed to live if he killed all the cattle? As soon as Zhou heard their voices, he froze. The knife fell from his hands and he ran towards them, hugging them tightly as his voice trembled. He told them it was so good to see them again, that this time he would protect them no matter what happened. His parents looked at him, confused by his strange behavior, but he didn't stop. He explained that there was no time for details, that they just had to trust him and that they needed to kill all the cows immediately and sell the meat, because every minute counted. His father stared at him, hesitated for a second, and then nodded. He said he trusted him because, after all, Zhu was the only college graduate in the village, and, if he spoke so seriously, it was because he knew something they didn't. His mother sighed, then rolled up his sleeves and, without a word, joined the slaughter. The neighbors watched in disbelief, whispering that the entire family had gone insane, but so knew time was running out, and there were only a few hours left before everything fell apart. He then turned to the crowd and shouted that he needed 3 men to help butcher the livestock, offering 800 yuan in cash to each. The unemployed men instantly perked up, shoving and yelling over each other for a chance to make some quick money. Without wasting any time, So called a local butcher and sold all the meat at half price, with a single condition, cash only, and immediate pickup. His parents watched him in silence, heartbroken, as they saw the livestock they had raised for so many years turn into cash and meat in a matter of hours. But So didn't stop to explain. He pocketed the money and told them he had to go to town. Before leaving, he turned to them and warned them firmly to stay inside, not to open the door no matter what, and to wait for his return. He got into the truck and drove off down the dirt road. His first stop was a store where he bought everything needed for self-defense. Then he went to the pharmacy, where he cleared the shelves of emergency supplies. However, he was still missing something more important than anything else: gunpowder. He knew that in the first days of the apocalypse, whoever had firepower would be in control. With the rest of the money, he went to a small factory that appeared to produce fireworks, but secretly trafficked illegal black powder. And the irony was that the owner of that place was none other than Link, the same guy who had stolen his girlfriend. Sue walked in without hesitation and tossed a bag full of money onto the table. Link raised an eyebrow and then burst out laughing. He said to look who was back, asking if he was still hung up on that girl, and if that money was to win her back with explosives. But So didn't even flinch. He replied coldly that he was there on business, that he wanted to know how much gunpowder Link had left, and that he would take it all. Link's smile vanished instantly, and his tone changed. He started saying they were a legitimate business that didn't get involved in illegal things. So then smirked and told him he was sure they did, because last year a woman in a blue coat had appeared near the back mountain, and that if he wanted to, he could go dig her up and ask her what really happened there. Link's face turned pale, and sweat broke out on his forehead. After a long pause, he turned to the woman beside him and told her to take him to the warehouse. As they walked away, Link leaned back in his chair and laughed coldly, muttering that someone finally knew about that little secret, and his eyes narrowed with malice. However, he thought the guy wouldn't be around for much longer. He returned home with his supplies and quickly called his older brother to help him unload. However, his brother had bad news. His younger sister, who was studying in the city, hadn't come back yet. So froze. In his past life, she had already been home by this time, which made him wonder if his early actions might have caused a butterfly effect. There were only 30 minutes left before the outbreak began. Without saying a word, he jumped back into the truck and sped toward the city. He yelled at his family not to leave the house, and not to open the door until he returned. The tires screeched as he floored the gas pedal while racing toward the school. He knew that most of the infections on the first day started with animals, but the schools were crowded, and once it got there, all chaos would break loose. Suddenly, the truck shook violently, as if it had hit something. He slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the vehicle to check. A mutated dog lay on the road, convulsing, its eyes glowing blood red and its fangs dripping with a thick black liquid. The outbreak had already begun. Meanwhile, the news that Su had killed his livestock had already gone viral in Shanghai. His younger sister, named Xiaomin, was immediately labeled as the school weirdo. In class, Xiaoya saw Xiaomin remaining silent and grew bolder with every word. Waving her phone, she mocked her, saying that her whole family was crazy and that her older brother had killed all their cows just to marry some village girl, which she found pathetic. Xiaomin snapped, slammed her desk, and snatched the phone from Xiaoya's hands. Just then, the teacher walked in, saw the commotion, and confiscated the phone, without a word. After class, while Xiaomin stayed behind to clean, Xiaoya ambushed her, pushed her down, and pulled out a knife. She told her she'd pay for breaking her phone, but before she could make a move, her body began to convulse violently. A stream of black blood shot from her mouth. She collapsed, coughing and vomiting uncontrollably. Xiaomin screamed and stumbled into the hallway, terrified. The whole school was already in chaos. Screams of pain, pleas for help, and the pure sound of horror echoed through every hall. Xiaomin barely had time to process what was happening. A zombified classmate, eyes bulging and mouth agape, lunged at her. She collapsed in terror, frozen on the floor. The zombie fell flat on its face with a gruesome thud. Just then, Soya staggered out of the classroom, already fully turned. Her body twisted unnaturally, a grotesque grin plastered on her face. She shrieked and charged straight for Xiaomin. Right before impact, however, Zhou arrived just in time, landing a flying kick that sent Soya flying down the hall, crashing into a window. The other zombie got back up. Zhou didn't hesitate. He drew a blade in one fluid motion. With a flash of steel, the zombie's head hit the floor before its body did. Zhou turned and saw his little sister, Xiaomin, trembling and crying, trying to lighten the mood. He joked with her, saying he heard her screaming from the next town over. The school was already completely overrun by zombies. Screams echoed from every direction. Zhou took her hand and told her there was no time to waste. They ran for the parking lot. Inside the car, Xiaomin managed a shaky smile. She asked if they were sure this wasn't a horror movie, but he looked at her and saw right through her facade. He spoke softly, telling her it was okay to cry if she needed to, that the world had changed, and that they had to learn to live in it. He assured Xiaomin that Mom, Dad, and Big Brother were safe at home. She finally managed a weak smile, but in their village, under the illusion of peace, danger was already brewing. When they got home and confirmed everyone was safe, Zhou nodded and said he needed to find someone. His mother began to protest, but Xiaomin spoke up, asking her to let him go. The girl who had just run for her life now saw him with clarity. Her brother was no longer the same man he was before. Zhou could feel something awakening inside him, a strange power rising from the chaos within. It was raw, untamed, but full of infinite possibilities. As his thoughts turned to a figure from his past life, a lone warrior who cut through the tide of zombies like a ghost, he thought that if he could find that man in this life, he would be an invaluable ally. Meanwhile, at the People's Committee building, Xiaoyin was bracing herself against the door with all her might, still believing that the villagers were just panicking, not fully grasping the threat. However, suddenly, a large gray hand beside her burst through the wooden door. Seconds later, blood-soaked zombies stormed in, growling and clawing, leaving the village officials frozen in terror and completely overwhelmed. Just when all hope seemed lost, the window shattered, and Zhu leaped in, his knife gleaming. In the blink of an eye, zombies were falling one after another. He then rushed to Xiaoyin's side, gently holding her face and checking her for any signs of infection. Only when he saw she had no blood or bite marks on her did he let out a sigh of relief. She, who in his past life was cold, authoritative, and almost untouchable, now looked fragile, almost human. Just then, the man with glasses shouted, questioning why he had killed them, as those were their neighbors, people they had lived with for years. Zhou exhaled slowly. Trying to stay calm, he replied that they weren't human anymore, as just one bite or even a drop of infected blood was all it took. They were zombies now. The man adjusted his glasses and, raising his voice, claimed that they didn't was about zombies, that the old man was just looking for his missing granddaughter, and that they should call the police, leaving it to the authorities to handle the situation. At that moment, Ling appeared from the back, clapping slowly with an arrogant smirk, and commented that he was a tough guy. Then, he sarcastically asked if he was also going to say the government was part of the conspiracy. He laughed with disdain, and downplaying the situation, he mocked the theories about zombies, suggesting that whoever believed them had probably been reading too many web novels. His mocking tone fanned the crowd's panic, which began to fill with anger. Some started shouting that he should be tied up and handed over to the police. Just as chaos was about to erupt, Xiaoyin stepped forward and shouted that Zhou had saved everyone's life. She told them to believe what they wanted, but that those villagers were no longer acting like humans. Zhou gave Xiaoyin a grateful look, and then spoke firmly, proposing that if they still didn't believe him, he could show them the truth in the forest behind the mountain. Ling's eyes narrowed. He had already noticed Zhao's strange behavior in the city, hoarding weapons and supplies, and now he was almost certain that this man knew something. He thought that if Zhou had anything that could expose him, he had to die no matter what. With a fake smile, he gathered some of his thugs and said he would go with them just in case. Xiaoyin and the man in the glasses, Wan Tao, also offered to join, as she was worried about the villagers, and Wan Tao still hadn't heard from his missing wife. In addition, the village chief had gone out earlier that day to investigate the disappearances and had not returned. When the group reached the back mountain, they quickly found his abandoned vehicle, parked next to the forest. They touched the hood, which was still warm. Zhou muttered that he hadn't been gone long, narrowing his eyes as the pieces from his past life began to fall into place. He said that if things unfolded the same way, this forest could be the epicenter of the first zombie outbreak. However, even after searching the entire mountain, they found nothing, until they noticed a strange entrance to a cave hidden among the rocks. The ground was stained with blood, and the air smelled of rot, which indicated that zombies had passed through. Zhu, without hesitation, said he was going in to check. Link immediately scoffed, suggesting he was just going to destroy the evidence and asking if he was hiding some little crime in there. Zhu shot him a cold glare and told him that if he was scared, he should stay put, and if not, to follow him and shut up. Just as he took a step towards the cave, a figure leaped from the shadows. Wang Tao cried out in joy seeing it was his missing wife. He ran forward with open arms, but in the next second, Asane bared her teeth and went straight for his throat. Zhao roared for her to not touch him and, in the blink of an eye, lunged forward, jamming his knife between Asane's jaws. Without hesitation, he plunged the knife deep and finished her. Turning to check on Wang Tao, the man let out a broken cry and threw a wooden stick at him, accusing him of killing his wife. And as he was knocked to the ground, his face grim and silent, Zhu remained calm. In a low, deep voice, he told him he understood his pain, but that Asane was gone, that she had turned, that he had no other choice, and was just trying to keep the rest of them alive. Then, Wang Tao staggered to his feet, and, with his voice trembling with grief and rage, shot back that it was easy to say, but if he were to kill his family in front of him, could he really remain so calm? Those words hit him like a slap. His mind flashed back to his past life, to the bodies of his loved ones lying cold and broken, soaked in blood. His breath hitched. Then, with a snarl, he grabbed Wang Tao and lifted him into the air as if he weighed nothing, his eyes sharp as blades. He told him that in this life, no one threatens his family and gets away with it, as he raised his sword. However, from his side, Link's voice cut in with a mocking laugh, saying that maybe he wasn't so different from the monsters after all. Just then, a strong hand struck Zhu's wrist, stopping the attack. Then, bam, from ahead, slammed him to the ground as a familiar voice growled for him to wake up. "You fool." Looking up, he saw his older brother, Cao Min, his face grim but firm, who looked at Wan Tao, still lost in his grief, and suddenly shouted that he had seen what his wife had become, that nobody wanted that, and that if he needed someone to blame him, because her death was his fault too, but now he had to pull himself together, that he was a leader of the people and that these people still needed him. Then, Wan Tao trembled, clenching his fists and finally nodding slowly and with difficulty until the tension was broken, just as a faint cry echoed from the cave, calling for help. Although it was the village chief's voice, everyone froze because something in that tone was too controlled, too human. Then, one of Ling's thugs rolled his eyes and scornfully said, "What a bunch of cowards," that he would get him out himself. And right after, he entered the cave with a firm step, but he didn't get very far, because a wet slicing sound cut through the silence. His torso was split cleanly at the waist, as blood splattered everywhere. A grotesque zombie creature dragged the upper half of his body, and then tossed it aside like trash. Behind it, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of glowing red eyes lit up the darkness. The horde had awakened. What he saw was far beyond what he had imagined, as the number of undead pouring out of the cave was absolutely astounding. And even if he could fight, how would he protect Zhou and his brother? Luckily, the Zhou brothers had trained since they were children under a retired military martial arts master. Their skills were worthy of professional fighters. Then, Zhou warned to aim for the head, because they were sensitive to direct light, and the brothers moved in perfect sync, slashing and dodging, until they cleared the immediate area in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, Ling was hiding behind a tree, too scared to even breathe. But deep in the cave, the same chilling cry for help was heard again. Zhou and Cao Min exchanged a look, until Zhou told them to go back, because from that point on it was too dangerous and they would only slow them down. Without hesitation, the two of them, they ventured into the darkness, and it wasn't long before Zhou was stopped abruptly upon finding a corpse, as dry as a husk with its heart completely missing. Then, that same voice began to whisper again in an animalate, unnatural way through the air, as Aming raised his flashlight and swept it across the cave. There, the village chief was sitting with his back to them, in complete silence, until he suddenly turned around with a pale face and empty eyes, and from his chest, tentacles began to peel away, lunging toward them with terrifying speed. Zhou reacted instinctively, slashing with his sword toward the creature's head. But the moment it made contact, he knew something was wrong because it barely flinched. He realized this wasn't an ordinary zombie, it was a mutant. Just then, the tentacles threw him against the cave wall. The beam of Aoming's flashlight illuminated the creature's face, which shrieked and recoiled violently from the light. They seized the moment to escape, panting outside the cave. When Aoming turned to his brother, shocked, he asked what the hell that thing was. Zhou exhaled slowly, and said he believed they were dealing with a cross-species infection, some kind of genetic recombination between animals and humans that were no longer just undead, but had evolved. He nodded toward the dark, open mineshaft, explaining that his guess was there was a whole nest of mutant bats in there, and that thing was probably a second-stage variant that was perhaps once the village chief. Upon seeing the full moon, it had transformed, and he added that, luckily, the night was clear, because those things fear the light and won't come out easily. Then, Aoming looked at him in disbelief, asking him since when he was a virologist. Zhou shrugged with a half-smile, saying he had probably watched too many documentaries before the world went to hell. Just as they were about to head back, planning to return the Ostais, next day with the proper equipment to face the mutant, a cloud of glowing eyes suddenly burst from the cave. It was a horde of mutated bats, and the sky darkened in an instant as the moonlight was swallowed by a sea of wings. Taking advantage of the chaos, the mutant zombie launched itself like a projectile, brutally striking Cao Min and sending him flying. One of its tentacles shot out, shattering the lantern he was holding, making its intention clear, because it had locked onto Cao Min as its target. Zhu gritted his teeth, pulling with all his might, but it was useless, as the monster's power was overwhelming, far beyond what any human could withstand. And just as the creature's jaws were about to snap shut on Cao Min's hand, Zhou was frozen, horrified and helpless. But then, out of nowhere, a car appeared at full speed, and the door flew open, revealing Oben at the wheel, who without hesitation aimed and rammed into the mutant zombie, sending it flying. This allowed Zhou to seize the opening to lunge forward and deliver the final blow, finishing the creature for good. When they realized that the monster was actually the village chief, Xiaoyin was visibly shaken, while Cao Min exhaled deeply with a tired but sincere voice, saying that if he hadn't arrived just in time, they would both be dead by now. But before they could catch their breath, Zhu turned pale when he clearly saw a bite mark on Cao Min's forearm. Cao Min managed a faint, weary smile, saying he was sorry, that now he would have to take care of the family, and as for what came next, he didn't need to say it, because those words pierced Zhou like a blade. Deep down, he already knew that he would have to be the one to end his brother's suffering, and as he looked at his infected brother, Zhou was overwhelmed by guilt. He thought that rebirth had given him the chance to change fate, to protect his family, but he wondered why history was repeating itself. Then, his eyes locked onto the mutant's corpse, and he ran towards it, ripping the sword from its skull, beginning to smash its head again and again, without stopping, as blood splattered everywhere. Cao Min, believing his brother had lost his mind from grief, screamed his name, begging him to stop. Xiaoyin also shouted, trying to stop him, but So didn't stop because he had just remembered something. He knew that high-level zombies absorbed the viral energy from lower-level ones and condensed it into a crystallized core hidden deep within the skull. Moments later, he found a dark, blood-stained crystal lodged in the back of the creature's brain. Then, he turned to Xiaomin, his voice firm and his eyes blazing with hope, saying she hadn't transformed yet, that there was still time, and with that, he held out the crystal, explaining in a grave voice that it was a zombie core formed from concentrated viral matter that shared the same source as the one now in her body. He said that if she took it, there was a chance she would evolve into an enhanced immune type, though there was also the possibility of turning into one of those monsters. Xiaomin barely glanced at it before swallowing it without hesitation. Su, wavering for an instant, knew deep down it was her only chance. After swallowing it, Xiaomin gave a crooked smile, saying he seriously had that the whole time and could have spared her the drama, asking when it would start to take effect. So answered seriously, saying in 2 days. Xiaomin nodded, looking toward the cave, saying that if she didn't come out by then, they should seal it, but if she came out with superpowers, they had better not get jealous. Seeing her walk away so calmly, So finally felt the weight in his chest lighten a bit, because he believed in her, and with a faint smile, he whispered that he would be waiting for her. Meanwhile, hidden behind a nearby tree, Ling had been listening to the entire conversation. A sinister smile spread across his face. So that's how it is. Fine, then let me help speed things up. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Xiaomin burst into Su's room with her handmade battle gear. Brother, time to get up. Su smiled with pride and responded. She had said they needed to reinforce their defenses and had stayed up all night making that armor. It turned out pretty cool. I was hoping you'd acknowledge it. However, he casually extended his hand and poked the armor with a finger. The armor fell to the ground like a rolling barrel, and Su stared at it silently, saying that was his armor, and asking what he was going to do when the zombies showed up. Was he going to roll them to death? Shaking his head, Su walked outside only to see his dad balancing on a ladder, stacking bricks to reinforce the courtyard wall. Mr. Su saw him and shouted that he was up. He jumped down from the wall, grabbed a nearby powder keg, and walked over with a big grin. He asked where he got that, and added to let his old man have a few barrels to play with. Su sighed, and replied that it was gunpowder, not a toy. However, Mr. Su had already slung the barrel over his shoulder, and was running off happily, saying he just wanted one, and that he was being too stingy. Seeing his dad so excited, Su muttered, "Please don't blow up the house." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the courtyard. Su turned and saw his mother with pans tied to her head, wielding a trident, and with her feet planted on a yoga roller, training with his little sister, who was mimicking her moves. Su watched the scene and thought to himself, "Yep, they're definitely mother and daughter." Then, with a slight smile, he asked aloud if there was any breakfast today. Without turning, she replied to just make whatever he wanted, as she was busy, and went back to perfecting her fork technique. Su thought to himself, "I guess I'll go ask Uncle Neo for food." At that moment, Xiaobin had been waiting at Su's gate for a while, about to press the doorbell. When the door opened from the inside, Su came out surprised and said he was already there, asking him what he was doing outside. Xiaobin lowered his head, hesitating. Then, as if mustering his courage, he looked up and said loudly that he needed his help with something. Su blinked, and somewhat confused, asked him with what. Just then, his mother arrived at the door too. Seeing who it was, she smiled warmly and said, "Oh, it's Xiaobin. Come in, come in." Xiaobin bowed politely. He thanked Mrs. Su, but told her he wouldn't be staying long, as he was there to talk to Su. She turned to him with a serious tone and explained that the village committee had started organizing defenses. Everything was going well so far, but she had contacted the county police station last night, and since then, she hadn't heard anything back. There were no messages, and this morning there was no signal at all. Zhou quickly checked his phone, but found no signal bars. He frowned and commented that it was strange, as this hadn't happened last time. Xiao Yin continued in a tense voice, saying she had a bad feeling, as being cut off could mean they missed something critical, like any support that might be on its way. She looked him in the eyes and added that she needed him to go with her to the county, as they had to find out what was going on. Zhu remained silent, clearly troubled by what Xiao Yin had said. Sensing his hesitation, Xiao Yin bowed deeply and said she was sorry, that she knew her brother had been through hell yesterday, and now she was asking him to take another risk. She looked up with firm eyes and explained that she had to go to the county to find out what was happening because it was her responsibility, and he was the best fighter she knew. He understood those creatures better than anyone. At that moment, Zhu's mom chimed in gently, interrupting her. She told her that was enough, that if it weren't for Xiaobin yesterday, her foolish son wouldn't have made it back at all. Xiao Yin turned toward the voice, surprised. Mrs. Zhou added that what happened with Xiaomin was her choice, that Xiao Yin shouldn't blame herself, and to wait there a moment. Then she turned to her son and told him to go with her. Zhou looked at his mother and followed her into the house. Inside, she stood still, searching for something on an old wooden shelf. Without turning around, she spoke softly, saying that she and his father were his parents, that they weren't supposed to hold him back, they should protect him, not crush him. She told him he was grown up and still making his little sister worry. With that, she took out a long sword wrapped in old cloth. Time had aged it, but its edge still shone faintly. Zhou and Xiaoyin walked side by side, heading towards the county. Behind them, Zhu's mother stood silently by the door, watching them until their figures disappeared into the distance. A faint smile appeared on her face as she mumbled to herself, "Those two make a great couple, there's no doubt about it." Meanwhile, deep inside the cave, Cao Ming stood motionless, waiting for his body to react to the zombie core he had just swallowed. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching, thinking it was his brother. He opened his mouth to say something, but felt something wet seeping into his boots. Frowning, he dipped a finger into the liquid and brought it to his nose. As soon as he smelled it, his expression changed, knowing it was gasoline. Before he could react, a spark ignited at the cave's entrance, followed by a deafening explosion. Flames shot through the tunnel, and Cao Ming was engulfed by the fire in an instant. Meanwhile, Cao and Xiaoyin were traveling on the road to the county to look for help. Xiaoyin was sitting in the passenger seat, nervously looking out the window and softly humming a melody completely out of tune. Cao glanced over and couldn't help but think she really was tone-deaf. Noticing his gaze, Xiaoyin blushed slightly and muttered, "Sorry, I hum when I'm nervous." But despite this confession, Cao didn't laugh. In fact, he felt a strange warmth. She was clearly scared, but she still forced herself to keep going. In that, he realized she was the one from his past life. With so many unexpected variables, he realized this time he couldn't just rely on the memories of his past life. Besides, her sensitivity to zombies was something he had to rely on. Without warning, he said, "Xiaoyin, you should come stay at my place." She froze, looking at him and blushing slightly. "Why would I do that?" she asked softly. He didn't even notice the change in her tone, as he was still lost in thought. If I told her about her future powers, she would never believe me. So, instead, he just said directly, "Because I need you safe, I can't afford to lose you." Just as Xiaoyin, her cheeks still flushed, was about to ask him what he meant by that, Cao suddenly frowned. Up ahead, the road was completely blocked by a massive landslide. They quickly got out of the car to inspect, observing the mountain of debris. Xiaoyin sighed in frustration. "There's no way we can get to the county like this." Zhou didn't respond immediately, but inwardly he was tense. This road was fine in my past life. Something has changed. Not just the weather, but the entire path. If this route is really cut off, we're going to have serious problems with supplies in the future. He finally exhaled. "Let's go back to the village. We'll find a solution." Xiaoyin nodded silently. On the way back, Zhu's mind was racing. They had enough supplies to last for now, but with no signal, no way out, everything felt like it was closing in. Suddenly, there was a thud. The car shook violently and started to slide toward the edge of the bridge. Zhou slammed on the brakes, gripping the steering wheel tightly. With a screech of tires, the vehicle stopped just inches from falling off the edge. Both of them jumped out quickly to see what had happened. Xiaoyin looked at the ground, trembling, and her voice shook. His face darkened. "Don't get any closer, it's a spike strip. Someone put it there on purpose." Just then, a voice mockingly echoed from above. Well, it didn't take you long to get cozy with our pretty village chief. I have to say, I'm impressed." They looked up and saw Ling crouching on the railing, twirling a pistol between his fingers. With his eyes full of menace, Zhu asked what the hell he wanted, to which Ling smiled smugly, and told him that because he had wiped out half of his group last night, as their leader, he couldn't let it slide. So, without hesitation, he jumped down and began to walk towards them slowly, step by step, taunting them. "You want revenge? Then go fight the zombies, not us." His eyes narrowed. "But after how you freaked out last night, I doubt you have the guts." That did it. Ling's face twisted with rage as he cursed him out. However, Zha calmly rested his hand on the hilt of his sword and, with a cold smile, told him, "Go on. Try me." But just as the tension reached its peak, he turned his weapon and shot at Oben without any warning. The shot rang out, and she collapsed immediately, as blood blossomed quickly on her shirt. Sol stood completely still, his eyes wide open, and roared Ling's name, calling him a damn psycho. Then Ling burst out laughing. He said he liked this, that he was finally feeling something. With a cruel smile, he added that if he really wanted to hurt him, the best way was to attack those he cared about most. Then, with an even more malicious expression, he revealed that he had seen Sol's brother get bitten the night before. Since he knew he couldn't finish him off, he decided to do him a favor and blow up the entire mine. Hearing that, Sol froze, as if he had been struck by lightning. In just a second, his eyes turned red with fury, and, with a roar, he drew his sword and lunged immediately at Ling. The latter just smiled maliciously, muttering that this was exactly what he wanted, as he raised his gun to shoot. However, at that precise moment, a dark shadow emerged at full speed from between the trees. With a gruesome crunch, the creature sank its jaws into Ling's arm, tearing it clean off. Ling fell to the ground, howling in pain like a slaughtered pig, as he stared in horror at the being that had just mutilated him. Sol stopped in his tracks, surprised by the sudden chaos. Looking closely, he understood what was in front of him: a zombie wolf. Meanwhile, in the village, Salman was sitting on a rooftop, swinging her legs and muttering because her second brother and Xiaoyin hadn't returned yet. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed from the main gate, and a voice shouted from outside, asking if Isa was home and demanding they open up. Salman peeked her head over the edge and replied that her brother wasn't there, while asking what was happening. Huan Tao, visibly distressed, pointed toward the mountain and told her to look. Then, he raised his phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it into the distance. When the beam of light illuminated the hillside, her eyes widened completely. There, coming down the slope, a black wave of zombies approached the town like a living, unstoppable tide. As this happened, Lin lay on the ground, slowly bleeding out. Barely conscious, he cursed through gritted teeth, wondering if this was really the end that awaited him. Meanwhile, the zombie wolf slowly turned its red gaze toward Zhu. The latter's instinct screamed that something was wrong. The creature had chosen him as its next target. With a deafening howl, the beast launched itself directly at him. Without thinking, Zhu reacted with lightning-fast reflexes, dodging to the side and slashing the monster's chest with his sword. As it passed, the creature collapsed, shrieking in pain as its blood splattered on the ground. Zhu took a second to catch his breath without looking away from the wounded enemy. He thought it was good that it was still daytime, as its power would increase at nightfall, and both he and Xiao Bin wouldn't stand a chance. Therefore, he understood they had to finish the battle before the sun disappeared completely. Suddenly, a chorus of deep, guttural howls rose from deep within the forest. Zhu froze when he heard them, and instantly understood their meaning. These weren't just zombies, but a whole horde. He quickly looked into the distance, where a new wave of the undead was advancing through the forest. He then remembered that the village chief had been identified as the source of the infection, but he was already dead. Then he wondered if the bats could be the real culprits. Just as all the pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind, the zombie wolf lunged at him again, accompanied by a heart-rending roar. Its claws descended with savage force, ready to tear him apart. At the last second, Zhu twisted his body and narrowly dodged the fatal blow. His heart was pounding. He wondered how it was possible for the creature to still move so fast when it should have been dying. It was then that he noticed it. The wound he had just inflicted was closing, healing at a great speed, right before his eyes. Before he could regain his balance, the beast opened its enormous jaws and lunged at him again, determined to tear him to shreds. Meanwhile, deep in the cave where Salman had been buried, the rubble still trembled from the earlier explosions. A roar echoed with increasing force through the tunnel, until an explosion sent rocks flying in every direction. From within the smoke, Salman emerged, his body radiating a crimson glow, and a cold, twisted smile on his face. Back on the bridge, Xiaoyin watched in horror as the zombie wolf lunged at Zhu. Her voice trembled as she muttered, pleading for it not to happen. But just then, a strange red aura erupted from Zhu's body. A fiery glow pulsed beneath his skin like living energy. The power surged through him, raw, wild, and uncontrollable, as if his entire being was burning and being reborn. With a deep roar, he threw his fist directly at the monster's jaw. The wolf zombie, completely caught off guard, reeled back from the devastating blow. It shrieked loudly, blood gushing from its mouth as it fell to the ground. Zhou gave it no chance to recover. With his eyes glowing red, he lunged forward, raised his sword, and with a clean, brutal slash, split the creature in two. As the dust settled, Xiaoyin stared in disbelief at the blood-soaked silhouette. Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned to her with a gentle smile, saying he was there, before weakly collapsing to the ground. Xiaoyin managed a faint smile, and said with a laugh that as long as he was okay, everything was fine. Then she glanced at the zombie wolf split in two, and then back at him, who stood firm and calm. She let out a small laugh, commenting that he was ridiculously strong, and that somehow it didn't surprise her, because deep down she had already begun to believe he could fix anything. He clasped his own hands and noticed that the power coursing through his body had not yet faded. It pulsed wildly, yet under control. He wondered where it came from and if it could be an awakening. However, something didn't add up. In his past life, no one had awakened without a crystal core, and he had never used one. He snapped back to his senses, and his eyes locked onto the horde of undead charging toward them. His tone became firm, saying this wasn't the time to talk, that they had to move because they were surrounded, and if they stayed there, they would die. Noticing the wound on Xiaobin's leg, he stepped forward and told her she couldn't run like that he would carry her, and to hold on tight because it was going to be a bumpy ride. Gritting her teeth, Xiaobin struggled to get to her feet, her face pale with pain, but she nodded with determination. The horde roared like a wave crashing against the shore, their growls cutting through the air as they drew closer and closer. Zhu didn't hesitate. He hoisted Xiaobin onto his back and ran towards the town with everything he had. The silhouette of the town appeared in the distance, but the undead were closing in fast. Their footsteps echoed like the drums of death. Zhou looked back, quickly calculating. There were too many. Even if he could defeat them all, he couldn't protect Xiaobin. Just as he gritted his teeth and prepared to keep running, a roar echoed in the distance. A vehicle burst into the chaos like a missile, plowing through the zombies as if they were made of paper. It was a heavily modified off-road truck, spitting fireballs from its rear exhaust. When it arrived, the driver executed a sharp turn, and the rear of the vehicle swept a wall of flames that engulfed the zombies coming from behind, reducing them to ashes in an instant. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and the driver's side window rolled down, revealing Zhu's father with a cigar hanging from his lips and a big grin. He yelled that Dad had come to save the day. From the passenger seat, Salman waved excitedly, saying that she was also there and that the fire support was locked and loaded. After getting them into the vehicle, Zhu's father floored the accelerator, heading back towards the town. Seeing that the zombies were still chasing them, he yelled at Salman to throw 3 dragon-style bombs. She responded instantly, without missing a beat, pulling 3 homemade incendiary bombs from her backpack and tossing them out the back window. Flames erupted behind them, setting several zombies on fire, but they kept running, engulfed in flames. Zhu's father let out a snort, coldly, and said that if they kept chasing them, even while on fire, then it was time to up the intensity. He tossed a gunpowder barrel out the window and, with a quick flick, threw his lit cigar right into it, causing a massive explosion that lit up the night and engulfed the road in a fiery inferno. Salmi clapped from the back seat, her eyes shining, saying that was insane and to keep it up. Meanwhile, Zhou and Xiaobin exchanged a look of bewilderment and disbelief, thinking that maybe this family was crazier than the zombies themselves. Zhou suddenly remembered there was a first aid kit under the seat. He leaned down to get it, but just as he grabbed bandages and ointment, Xiaomi snatched them away, scolding him for grabbing a girl's leg like that. Then, with a mischievous grin, she hinted that maybe there was something between them she didn't know about. Seeing how Xiaobin blushed and let out a shy giggle, Zhou just rolled his eyes, thinking that brat was always stirring up trouble. Ignoring her, he turned to his father and asked how everything was back home. Zhou's father kept his eyes on the rearview mirror as he calmly replied that they were fine for now and that the horde hadn't broken through the town's defenses yet. Then, Zhou nodded and looked at the explosives in the back of the vehicle and asked his father if he had really made all that dynamite. He also scolded him for smoking so close to it. His father laughed proudly, replying that, of course he did, since back in his day he was obsessed with explosives and worked in the mines as the team's demolitions expert. But when the mines ran out, he had nothing left to blow up, so he tried playing with firecrackers at home, though his mother quickly put a stop to that. As he let out a long sigh, he shook his head as if he'd been robbed of his true calling. Then Zhou remembered something and asked if the explosion in the kitchen last year had been his fault. His father tensed up visibly, replying in a trembling voice not to talk nonsense. But Zhou noticed he was shaking and told him he was nervous, to which his father asked him not to tell his mother anything. Shortly after, they arrived at the main gate, and as they got out of the car, they heard some high-pitched screams from the inner courtyard, which made Zhou's father's face turn pale. Then, he ran to the door and threw himself against it, saying it was locked from the inside. Without a second thought, the protagonist took a step forward, bent his knees, and kicked the door down with a powerful kick. Upon entering the courtyard, they saw a surreal scene. Zhu's mother was holding a struggling zombie with a single hand while looking at it with a cold expression, saying it was Aunt Yant from the neighboring village, and she hadn't seen her in a long time. At that moment, Zhu's father and Xiaomin peeked out from behind the broken doorframe, and seeing the furious expression on her face, they hid behind the wall. Then, Zhou cautiously called out to his mother, but she didn't look up. Still holding the frying pan, She told the zombie that it had really tried to scare her, and that it thought just because it had turned into that, it no longer had to pay her back. Immediately, she hit it with the frying pan, while demanding that it still owed her 500 from a card game. She said that when her son left for college, she gave her 600, but when her own was accepted, she received nothing. Plus, she had the nerve to speak ill of them. The protagonist watched everything in shock and approached his father, wondering when his mother had become so strong. His father replied calmly that she had always been this way, that back in her day, she was the most feared person in 10 villages, and that not even 3 or 5 men could stand up to her. He said everything calmed down when he met her, although in reality, she forced him to marry her. In that instant, a flying frying pan hit the back of his head, and from inside the courtyard, his wife's voice came out coldly, calling him a liar, and saying he was the one who begged to marry her. Then she turned to Zhu, accusing him of breaking down the door like a hero, and promising that when she got her hands on him, he wouldn't be spared. Zhou backed away and tried to sneak away, but Xiaobin came forward saying not to blame him, that he was actually worried about her. That made Zhu's mother stop. Upon seeing Xiaobin, her face completely softened, and she told him not she would take what he said before seriously, that she was just playing, and that she was also very calm. So stood there, not knowing what to say, thinking that his mother's performance was more terrifying than the zombies themselves. Just then, a roar erupted from the side of the courtyard wall, and a zombie that had climbed up was screeching loudly. Before it could jump, it was knocked down mid-air and fell outside. From atop the wall, Honatao shouted for them to stop chatting, that zombies were entering the village, and that a whole group was heading toward them from the west. Then, Su's eyes sharpened, summoning the energy within him. A red light flashed across his body, and he charged straight into battle, seeing his father throwing explosives and his sister operating a homemade cannon, while his mother charged in with her iron skillet. His heart filled with determination as he thought that this time they would fight together, that they wouldn't let a single one through, that he was no longer alone, and that with his family by his side, they would survive this tide of death. However, just when they thought they had it under control, the zombies at the back began to retreat. Cao Ming blinked, not believing what he was seeing, saying they were falling back or maybe they were scared. But So frowned and replied that zombies don't feel fear. As if to prove his point, the zombies reappeared, this time carrying ladders, crowbars, and even saws. They were getting organized, which left Cao's father stunned. He wondered if they were joking. Now they had tools. Were they dealing with zombies or a siege army? Su's voice turned cold as he said they weren't acting on instinct, that someone was controlling them. Amid the chaos, he suddenly caught a glimpse of a figure on a distant roof. He focused his eyes and realized it was Link, the man who was supposed to have died in the explosion, but was now standing there, looking down with a cold and disturbing smile. At that moment, the waves of zombies charged toward the So family compound, as relentless as a giant tidal wave. The protagonist's father cursed under his breath, and wondered why they were all coming straight for them. He turned and yelled that there were no explosives left, that they were all out. Nearby, Hong Tao's voice rang out, warning them that some were scaling the wall. So spun around and saw several zombies climbing over the side wall. His heart sank as he realized it was a diversion, that they were using tactics. Looking down, he saw Xiaobin and his parents surrounded, fending off the undead with what little strength they had left. The whole family was trapped in a desperate struggle, his own eyes narrowing as the red light flickered once more. He ordered them to hold the line in the courtyard and leave the rest to him. With that, his power surged, and he leaped from the wall, diving straight into the heart of the horde. Su's father watched as his son plunged into the horde, panic rising in his chest. He screamed, his voice breaking with fear, but in the next moment, the zombies swarmed over Su, burying him under a mountain of teeth and claws. However, beneath that crushing weight, So was unafraid. He closed his eyes and felt the energy inside him roar to life, like a volcanic storm. Gripping his sword tightly, he growled through his teeth. With a single, explosive motion, he swung his blade outward. A crimson wave of power erupted from his body, obliterating every zombie in its reach, turning them into flying pieces of flesh and bone. As the gore settled, Su stood tall, panting. The move had triggered a memory. In his past life, he had seen a man from the Dawn Legion, the Supreme Commander, one of the most powerful ability users alive. He had used this exact same move, but Su knew his version of Bloody Asura was still far from complete, and yet, he didn't care. He didn't need perfection. He didn't need to be the strongest. The only thing he needed was the strength to protect those he loved. He glanced up at the twisted figure on the roof. These zombies meant nothing. The real threat was the one controlling them. If they wanted to end the chaos, they had to take down the king. As another wave of zombies charged at him, So smirked, his eyes glowing red. He thought they couldn't possibly think this trash was enough to stop him. Just as he finished his words, a deafening roar exploded behind him. A chill ran down his spine. He turned just in time to see a zombie pouncing on Xiaobin. Before it could reach her, Zhu's mother hit it with her frying pan, sending the zombie flying. She ran to Xiaobin's side, her eyes filled with worry. She asked if she was okay and if she had been bitten, but Xiaobin shook her head. She was fine, and asked where Zhou was. From the front yard, Xiaomin shouted excitedly that she had seen him, that he was like a superhero, taking down zombies as if it were nothing. He would be fine. But just as her words fell, a thunderous crash echoed through the air. Xiaomin slowly froze, turned, and saw the bloodied and beaten protagonist among broken stones and dust, struggling to get up. He shouted in a hoarse voice for them to stay back, not to come closer, to run. In front of him stood a mutated zombie bear, twice the size of a truck, with its eyes glowing red and steel fragments protruding from its spine. Every breath the monster took released vapor like smoke from a furnace. It wasn't just watching them, it was hunting them. Zhu's body trembled with pain, but he forced himself to get up. He clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the beast, his voice low and determined. He knew that at that moment, he was the only one who could face this creature, and he would not let his family get hurt, not again. Reddening, he unleashed the energy within him. A storm of blood-red energy surrounded him like a wildfire. He stood firm in front of the monstrous zombie bear with his teeth gritted. If he had to die that day, he thought, he would do it protecting his family. Meanwhile, from the yard, his father, mother, and sister screamed in desperation for him to retreat. However, Zhou didn't move an inch. At that instant, the enormous zombie bear roared and lunged toward him, its claw coming down like a guillotine. Zhu dodged just in time, but before the claw could impact, a loud bang was heard, followed by a familiar voice. Then a figure said that, apparently, he could also use that kind of power. And to think she thought he was slacking off. As the dust settled, Xiaomin appeared, blocking the bear's claw with one hand. He calmly apologized for being late, and called him little brother. Then, Zhu's eyes widened in surprise and joy, recognizing him as his big brother. Right after, Xiaomin stretched his shoulders with a smile, saying it took him some time in the mountains to get used to this power, and looked at Zhou, telling him to watch carefully, because this was how you really use it. With a swing of his arm, Xiaomin threw the giant bear through the air. It flew like a derailed train, crashing into a pile of ruins with a deafening roar. Then, dusting himself off, Xiaomin spoke again, noting that the monster was still breathing and had a tough hide, calling it a giant hamster. Next, he calmly turned and told Zhu he would handle this, and that Zhou should go take care of what only he could. Zhou nodded with a look as cold as steel and understood. Then, he slowly turned, fixing his eyes on Ling, who was still on top of the distant rooftop. At that moment, memories of his past life came flooding back, his family dying in front of him, his helpless screams in the night, the bitterness, the rage, the endless nightmares. However, this time, with the power in his hands, he would destroy everything that threatened his loved ones. So, he took a step forward with a cold, sharp voice, calling out to Ling. He turned slowly, his previously severed arm now replaced by a grotesque, bear-like claw, let out a hoarse laugh and told him he was no longer talking to the old Ling, that he was dead. He smiled with unhinged eyes and bared fangs, saying that this body had broken free from the limits of humanity, that he was now part zombie and part man, with intelligence and control in one being, commanding the horde and keeping his mind in this apocalypse. That he was the king. Meanwhile, below, the zombie horde was swarming towards the building. Despite it all, Ling stood tall with his eyes closed, enjoying the dark power that flooded him. Then he smiled, saying that he should actually thank him. He claimed that if Zhou hadn't torn the zombie wolf to pieces, he wouldn't have received that crystal core on a silver platter. His voice dropped low as a cruel smile formed on his face, and he remarked that he had been thinking about how to thank him for that gift and had finally decided what to do. However, he didn't get to finish because a flash of steel cut through the air, and Zhu's sword came crashing down. As a result, Lin's head was split in two, with blood gushing out like a geyser. Zhou sheathed his sword with a cold expression, saying he was still the same coward, just with a bigger mouth, and thought himself worthy of being king. Then he turned, scanning the battlefield with his gaze, since with Lin gone, his older brother would be under less pressure. But then, a chilling laugh echoed from him. Consequently, he turned around slowly and saw Lin's body rising again, the crack in his skull closing, flesh pulsating, and bones knitting together with sickening crunches. His eyes now glowed a feral red as he smiled with a deeper, more monstrous voice. telling him that his sword couldn't kill him. Seeing that, Zhu's eyes widened in astonishment. He immediately raised his sword and held it before his chest, understanding that Lin had inherited the zombie wolf's regeneration and that he had to end it immediately. However, before he could attack, Lin appeared beside him like a shadow. His voice dripped like poison in his ear, telling him they were the same, that this was their era, to join him, that the dead would serve him, the living would feed them, that humanity would kneel like cattle under their rule. He then pointed toward the onrushing horde and commented that he had even brought him a gift, that he had eliminated the inferior bloodlines around them to prepare his welcome. Below, the zombie tide had already reached the walls. Meanwhile, inside the courtyard, Zhu's parents and the others were struggling to hold the line. From the side, Uncle Neo shouted that the west side was collapsing. Zhu's father was panting, sweat running down his face, yelling for them to hold on a little longer, trusting that Xiaosu and Zhu would finish soon. However, before he could catch his breath, a massive crash shook the ground. The giant bear's corpse landed beside him, kicking up a cloud of dirt and blood. At that moment, from behind the wall, Zaman's voice rang out with a mischievous tone, saying that guy really knew how to take a hit, so they could use him to plug the hole. The father then quickly turned, a mix of relieved and tense, and asked Zaman if his brother was all right. Meanwhile, Zaman watched the zombies approaching from all directions. He clenched his jaw, as there was no escape at this point. Therefore, he turned to his father and said with firmness not to worry, since So had more potential than he ever did, and would consequently put an end to all of this. Meanwhile, So was struck again by Lin's attack, and, as a result, was sent flying, crashing to the ground with the crack of bone. Next, dust exploded around him as he lay there, with blood dripping from his mouth and his body battered. It was then that Lin descended, crouching over the rubble with a malicious smile, and said with disappointment that if this was all he had, he could still forgive him if he knelt and swore loyalty. However, before the words could fully leave his mouth, a crimson flash cut through the air. In that instant, So lunged forward, and his sword pierced through Lin's chest, sending him flying through 3 stone walls. Despite the dust still swirling in the air, So stood tall, his eyes sharp and his voice cold, declaring that humans do not walk alongside beasts, and especially not with those that bear their fangs at his family. Afterwards, he walked toward the collapsed figure amidst the rubble, with his sword still dripping blood, and in a voice of judgment declared there was only one thing left to do: kill him. However, the wound on Lin's chest began to close almost immediately. Then, as he stood up, he licked the blood from his claw and, in a cold, threatening voice, said that if that was the case, then he sentenced him to death. In the blink of an eye, he lunged forward. His claw descended like a guillotine, slicing through the air with terrifying force. So barely raised his sword in time to block. Sparks flew from the clash. He was faster, stronger. Due to the force, Zhu's arms trembled. He couldn't hold on much longer. Blow after blow rained down mercilessly. Then, a sharp pain shot through his arm. A deep gash opened up, even through his blood barrier. Reacting instantly, he kicked back and stumbled several steps away, panting heavily. As he looked at the wound, his eyes narrowed. Not even his azure blood shield could hold on any longer. He was reaching his limit. On the other side of the battlefield, Ling licked his claw, taunting how impressive it was that Zhou had dodged that blow, as he really thought he'd be admiring his intestines. Despite his exhaustion, Zhou felt his strength fading and his vision blurring slightly. The blood aura flickered, dying. But then he looked up, stared directly at the monster before him, and tightened his grip on his sword. If he only had one strike left, then let it all end with that one. Before Zhou could even react, Ling suddenly appeared in front of him. With a malicious grin and glowing red eyes, he told him he had him, and that not even he knew how strong he was at his full power. Zhu froze for a second, just long enough for Ling's claw to slash a deep, brutal wound across his chest. Blood gushed from the gash, staining the ground, but in that instant, Zhou reached into his coat and, with a final burst of will, threw a homemade explosive directly at Ling's face. He yelled at him to enjoy the surprise. "Fool!" Then, boom! Flames roared, engulfing the area in a fiery inferno. However, from within the blaze, Ling's voice echoed, cold and mocking, saying that was a Molotov cocktail. Did he really think that would be enough to kill him? As the smoke cleared, Ling emerged unharmed, but Zhu was gone. Then he blinked, muttered that he had fled, and let out a manic, unhinged laugh. Nevertheless, his smile faded, and his eyes turned as cold as ice. He warned him to run all he wanted, but that he would find him, and when he did, he would tear him to pieces. Elsewhere, Zhu was collapsed inside a dark convenience store, gasping for air. Through the air, he clutched his wound tightly. Although sweat, Blood and pain mingled. His grip on the sword remained firm. He leaned against a cold shelf, his eyes fixed on his injured arm. Fortunately, the bleeding had stopped, not fully healed, but it was enough. He felt a spark of surprise, so the Blodura could also heal. However, his relief was short-lived. His energy was nearly depleted. He only had one move left, one last chance. Outside the gas station, footsteps echoed. Then Link's voice was heard, booming and cruel. He said sarcastically that a gas station was his hiding spot, that some die without any style, and that So had chosen a peasant's coffin. Meanwhile, his claw dragged across a rusty truck, drawing sparks with every scrape. The metal shrieked in protest. Then Link slowed his pace, his voice becoming low and deliberate, like a predator explaining the rules of the house. He said, "Wolves hunt even when they're not hungry, because they wish to taste the fear, to feel their prey's desperation as all hope fades and every trick fails. That moment of pure collapse," he assured, "is the best seasoning." With a twisted smile, he smashed into a nearby car. The vehicle flipped like a toy, landing with a deafening metallic screech. Link looked at the ground, following the trail of blood that led him to a thin, barely visible tripwire that was glistening faintly with gasoline. Above it hung a Molotov cocktail, ready to fall at the slightest touch. Link let out a mocking laugh as his grin widened. He said he wouldn't be foolish enough to follow that trail and walk right into the trap like a blind mole. He slowly raised a claw. His eyes narrowed as he stated that the strongest scent of blood was coming from up there. Suddenly, he leaped, and his claw tore through the roof, which collapsed in a storm of steel and wood. A blood-stained jacket fell at his feet. He picked it up, confused, not knowing that at that very instant, Sue was emerging from the shadows right in front of him. In a single motion, So threw a handful of powder into Link's face. The man screamed in pain, clutching his burning eyes. So approached, his voice calm and cold. He explained that it was salt, that Lin could no longer smell or see. A faint smile appeared on his face. He said that Lin couldn't smell anything anymore, and he couldn't see either. Zoe continued, stating that although Lin inherited the zombie wolf's strength, he also received its greatest weakness. A wolf's sense of smell has over 200 million cells capable of detecting millions of scents, which makes salt an absolute torture. He looked at him directly and stated that most people let their guard down when they think they've seen through a trap. He said that even though Lin called himself a king, he was no different, just a blind dog drowning in his own arrogance. Lin roared, his eyes wide with fury, and promised to kill him and tear him to pieces. Zoe calmly raised his sword and stated that he wouldn't get the chance. Blood energy surged through his arm, enveloping the sword in a crimson storm. Then he declared his technique, World Splitter. The slash descended with a flash of red light. Lin was slammed into the ground by a shockwave that shook the terrain. Through the smoke, Zoe watched the crater and muttered that he was still alive. He said that these monsters were really hard to kill. Lin lay bloodied, panting, but still growled through his teeth that he was a king, and that kings don't die. However, his eyes widened in surprise. He noticed a thick liquid, smelling of gasoline, beginning to rise around him. He yelled, asking what it was. Zoe's voice cut through the tension, calmly explaining that those incendiary bombs weren't enough. Upon seeing an underground fuel tank, he thought he'd test if that would be enough to send a monster like Lin to hell. He declared that this gas station was his coffin. The station exploded. Back in the village, Zoe's father was standing at the door with his weapons ready. A thunderous explosion shook the horizon. He looked up, confused, and saw a bright fireball rise like a second sun. He muttered that the sun had already risen. Salmon shouted excitedly for them to look. The zombies were beginning to retreat. The exhausted defenders smiled in relief. Zoe was walking back home, watching the rising sun with a faint smile, until a weak voice stopped him, asking for help. Turning around, he saw a pale, almost unconscious figure leaning against a wall and stopped. Meanwhile, back at the house, Salmon was glaring at her brother and asked accusingly, "Are you really that shameless?" Clearly frustrated, he sighed before replying that he was just checking if Lean had been bitten, adding that you couldn't just bring someone home because they seemed fine, as too many groups had been wiped out by that same mistake. Then, he added almost defensively that he wasn't wearing a shirt either, so technically it was fair. Salmon rolled her eyes in annoyance and retorted that it just made him sound even more shameless, adding that luckily, she stopped him in time, because if not, she would have seen it. Zoe opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the nearby door creaked open, and Xiaobin calmly walked out, saying that she was fine, that he had checked on her. She was just exhausted, both mentally and physically, and would wake up soon. He paused, looking at them both, and asked curiously why they had such weird looks on their faces. Salmon coughed, forced a smile, and replied that it was nothing, they were just happy she was okay, that was all. Then, Cao turned to him with a slightly warm tone in his voice and said, "Thanks for everything." Xiaobin looked down and replied quietly that he hadn't really done anything, that they were the ones who did all the hard work. After a short rest, Huan Tao, Uncle Neo, and Xiaobin prepared to leave, as they wanted to check the town for more survivors while there was still daylight, as it was part of their duty as members of the town council. Just before they left, Zhou called out to Xiaobin upon seeing the guilt in his eyes and told him not to blame himself. No one could stop a zombie tide in advance. They couldn't save everyone, but as long as they were alive, there was still hope. Xiaobin turned and smiled gently, replying that he knew and thanked him. From a car, Salman laughed and said that it wasn't bad, that her little brother was finally learning how to talk like a human being. So watched the group depart and murmured that this time, the end was, finally, different. Cao raised an eyebrow and asked what he was talking about, saying he hoped he wasn't referring to his emotional quotient, but then said it didn't matter. He sighed and started the engine, saying they needed to get moving, as they still had to take care of those bodies. The two of them drove into the mountains and began the final cleanup. Standing in front of the burning corpses, Zhu spoke softly, saying that these mutated bodies had to be incinerated, since if animals ate them, they could be facing the next disaster. He dusted off his hands and smiled, saying they could finally go home and get some real sleep. Then he added that Cao had to make sure to wash the car at the gas station because it reeked. Cao awkwardly scratched his head and said yes, but that about that gas station. He then frowned and asked why he had to be the one to do it. Cao threw an arm around his shoulders with a grin and replied that it was because he was his big brother, and asked if he had a problem with that. Zhu narrowed his eyes and said he knew the rules. Cao raised an eyebrow and asked if he was sure he could still beat him. Zhou snorted, saying he'd never lost a game of ghost tag. They quickly set up the game. Cao would be the ghost hunter, and Zhao would be the ghost. The rules were simple. The hunter counted to 10 while the ghost ran, and if he caught him within 3 minutes, he won. The ghost just had to run like hell. As soon as Zhu's power activated, he took off, and Cao laughed behind him, saying he'd actually used that trick, but reminding him that he knew it too. Before Zhou could react, Cao was already right behind him. He tried to grab him, but Zhu stopped short, twisted his body, and dodged to the side like a shadow. The two of them raced through the forest, leaping over roots, weaving between the trees, locked in a relentless game of chase. Suddenly, Zhu leaped high, aiming for a tree branch. Cao blinked in surprise and then grinned, saying that going airborne was a nice try. Without warning, he charged straight at the tree just as Zhao reached the branch. With a crack, the tree came crashing down. Startled, Zhu adjusted his position in midair and landed safely. Behind him, Salman was still smiling with a sword in his hand, which he'd just used to cut down the tree, and said that he thought he could escape that way, but he didn't have a chance. Zhou had barely touched the ground when he felt something huge coming from behind. He turned, only to see Salman throwing the entire tree trunk at him. Zhou crossed his arms, braced himself, and blocked it with all his might. The brothers were deadlocked, one pushing and the other resisting, with energy crackling between them. Salmin laughed with a challenging voice, saying his little brother was running away again. Zhou didn't respond to his brother's taunts, as he was too focused on resisting the tree trunk crashing into him, silently marveling at the raw power behind it. Realizing he couldn't take it head-on, he let the momentum carry him backward to absorb the impact. Moments later, the trunk smashed into the cliff with a deafening crash, sending up a cloud of dust and splinters. Salmin, standing amid the wreckage, scratched his head awkwardly and called out, wondering if he had overdone it. But he got no response. When the dust settled, he saw no one. Then, a pebble hit him on top of the head. The voice of Zhou floated down from above, announcing that time was up and that the ghost won this round. Salman looked up at the cliff and shouted, wondering when he had gotten up there, calling him a very sneaky brat. Zhou jumped down lightly, smiling, and explained that when he braced himself against the cliff to absorb the impact, he discovered a lot about how his powers worked. Salman nodded, saying that he had gotten his by absorbing a zombie core. Zhou casually replied that something similar had happened, though in his mind he added that, technically, it had occurred in his previous life. Then he said aloud that he thought his ability was something different, since he could harness other people's powers. Salman blinked in surprise. However, Zhu continued, stating that he could use others' powers not only by coincidence. He detailed how Salman's ability, the Blood Bastion, increased physical strength, speed, and defense, as well as how that crimson aura surrounding Salmin could block most physical attacks. Based on their little fight, Zhou believed he could replicate about 70% of those powers. Salman raised an eyebrow in surprise and commented that even though he had lost, that wasn't all. Zhou added that he thought he could also assess people's abilities in quite some detail. Salman, a bit confused, asked if they were talking about RPG character stats, as if Zhou had a personal interface. Zhou explained that it wasn't exactly that, but more of an instinct. He could feel the numbers behind a person's strength. For example, if an average adult's stats were 20, Salman's, in terms of power and agility, would be 90, and his stamina maybe 95. As for intelligence, Zhou was interrupted by Salman, who smiled and asked if that also made him smarter. Zhou smirked, and replied that his IQ was more like 0, and commented that watching him fight a tree stump had been painful. Salman, laughing, threw an arm over his shoulders, warning him that his 0 IQ could still knock his teeth out. Then, suddenly, he remembered something and said that the zombie bear's core crystal he had stored in his drawer might be useful.